Hey everyone for coming. I, this class I want to talk a lot about designing and modeling, but first I just want to introduce myself if you really don't know anything about me. Um, I am obviously Alex Seneschal. I'm a 3D artist. I do some 2D as well. I started just with game art, and I work at 343, and I'm an environment artist there, and I do a lot of just designing mostly alien architecture. But what I also like to do, and I'm going to be doing in the future, is more concept design stuff. And so that's kind of what this class is going to be around. A lot of the same workflows kind of apply to both. So, we're going to go over a lot of high poly modeling, but before we get into high poly, we're going to do mid poly, which they're kind of the same. Like, we're gonna basically model everything as if we're not going to subdivide it, and then we do subdivide it. At least a lot of the hard surface stuff. Um, but that's a very similar workflow to environments. If you're wanting to be an environment artist, it's really all basic modeling technique. So it doesn't really matter what you're trying to do, like the modeling and all of that we're going to do in here should apply to really anything that you want to do, whether it's concept modeling or modeling for games. It's just a little bit different for each, but the basic fundamentals kind of go are the same. So just a few examples of some of the things I've done as far as environments at 343 is, like this piece here, which was for Halo 5. And so this is some of the environment stuff, and I again, designed it all as well as created, like modeled it and put it in game and everything. But a lot of this stuff is also used with a similar workflows to what, oh man, there's nothing on? Hmm. Yeah, it seems like some people see the video and some don't.
Yeah, I I see like a still image.
Okay, yeah, I mean it's a still image, but some people don't see anything.
Oh, okay.
It should just be my ArtStation page. There shouldn't be a video, but somebody said they don't see anything.
For those that don't see anything, you might have to refresh. Uh,
I also had to install a plugin. I don't know if anybody else will have to.
right. The desktop version of this software works better than the mobile.
Hmm. Okay, that's good to know. Yes, I think we should give people like a minute or so to refresh.
Okay.
All right, we should be at 16 when when we're good to go again.
Yeah. It seems like people have refreshed and it's. I guess it's working.
Here we go. The last person arrived, I think. Hey, Zachy, or so I don't know if that's correct, but can you see it? Oh,
Uh,
17 now. Okay.
Looks like Zaki. I don't know.
Anyone not see anything? Or does anybody not see my screen? No, I didn't do the lighting and effects on these. Only on my personal work. All right. Cool. I think everybody can see it. So what I was saying before is basically like a lot of these modeling techniques are going to be used for whether you're doing games, which is just, at least in this case, for example, just mid-poly. So you have support loops and a lot of those things, but you also unwrap it and you don't subdivide it. So the idea of controlling smoothing and all of that and just basic modeling principles and techniques, applies to mid-poly modeling as much as high poly and low poly modeling. It's all the same thing. So it really doesn't matter what you're trying to achieve. Like a lot of the stuff that we're going to go over will benefit you no matter which thing you're going to do. There's just like slightly different things about going about different types of modeling. So anyways, these are some of the things that I did at 343. This was the end of the game, and I got to design and model it. So I'm going to kind of go over it again for people who didn't see my screen. I figured out how a lot of these environments would work, as well as what they'd look like in cinematics. So here's another example of the gateway. But the other stuff that I do and that I've done more recently is a lot of concept design stuff. So this is a weapon that I created and was used on the image for this class, so you've probably seen it. But there's some close-ups of it, and a lot of the techniques I use to make this and the environments are what we're going to be going over as far as modeling technique and then design as well. But yeah, so these are just some more examples, and all of these are primarily modeled in Max. Some of the organic stuff or more organic things I would go over in ZBrush, but I pretty much modeled them in Max as well. But yeah, anyway, these are just some examples. But what we're going to be making today, and get started on today, is going to be a gun, and I have some reference. But first, I just want to know, I just want to see what. Does anybody have any questions about what we're going to be doing, or what we could be learning, or anything like that? Yeah. And so, Armando, I won't necessarily be going over textures for game stuff. I'm going to be going over textures for KeyShot later in the course, and creating those textures and just talking about how to make materials for KeyShot. But it won't be game really. It's going to be none of this is going to be unwrapped. It's all going to be projected in KeyShot as far as the textures and materials go. So that won't necessarily apply, but the modeling does if you're doing game stuff. If that answers your question. So I think that it'd be best if everyone designed their own weapon. That was what I was thinking. If you want to follow along, you can, but I think designing is better because then it gives me a chance to give design feedback as well as answer people's questions. I want to be doing like red line overs on people's work in the forums. If people would like to post them, that'd be awesome. I like giving feedback. I also like giving feedback in general. When I talk about design stuff, feel free to ask questions because I care a lot about design theory and design in general. So asking me questions, and if you're not sure about something, like feel free to ask me because it can also help me be better at explaining it or maybe explaining it in a different way. Because I think design, which is one of the biggest things that I want to talk about on this course, besides modeling, is a subject where you learn about it, but you have to continually keep learning and improving and giving yourself feedback, right? And I'll probably go over design a little bit later today, but let me answer some of these questions. It doesn't have to be a weapon, but I think that it could be a little bit easier to go along with and also give critiques, so that way everybody kind of has a similar thing to compare, I guess, or give feedback on. But I mean, if you don't want to make a weapon, no one's forcing you to make a weapon. It's really up to you, but I think it would make sense for this course. That's up to you. And Ryan. So however you want to start, I'm going to basically go over kind of how I start. I don't always start things the same way. Sometimes they're in 2D, sometimes I just have an idea in my head. And with this particular one, I sketched out a few ideas beforehand, but I didn't really pick anything, and I have a few ideas in my head. But I also have some reference images. So I think, though, the way that I usually like to design is I may have some ideas or preconceived things, but I usually like to, once I start getting in there and making stuff in Max, usually it changes or it becomes something slightly different. So if you want to follow along, I would figure out what you feel most comfortable doing. I'm not going to be doing 2D first. I'm probably just going to be, opening up Max and start pushing polys. But I think that when you're starting out, sketching can help you get a direction for sure. But, I think it's really up to you what you want to do. You can follow along, but I feel like, follow along, but I think paying attention, I feel like I want to kind of give this class in a more demonstrative way where I work and I get questions and can answer questions. I think following along might be hard to kind of get all the information or see the things I'm doing. I think that it's probably up to you and what kind of time you have, if you don't have much more time than this. I think it would be beneficial to do it along with me. But if that answers your question, Zachy. Cool. Does anyone else have any questions? All right. All right, so just before we start getting into stuff, I'm going to open up one of my older, or the last weapon that I made and just kind of show it in KeyShot and a little bit of the setup. And I might try to open it in Max, but I can't guarantee it won't crash my computer, so I don't know if I'm going to do that. But I'll kind of show a little bit of like break down how I worked on it and some of the things that I thought about, not just when I'm bringing in a KeyShot, but when I'm modeling it and how I organize my my scenes and stuff like that. Just to kind of give you an idea of where we're going before we start going somewhere and making stuff. All right, so I got KeyShot. Let me make this bigger. Feel free to let me know if you can't see stuff. I have a really high-res screen, so I know that can make things frustrating. So if that's the case, feel free to let me know, and I can call something out or make it more clear. Let me go. All right, so I got my last gun that I made in KeyShot loaded up right now. And I'm just going to show you really quick kind of how I divided this model into pieces, because how I have it set up right now is kind of how I thought about it when I was making it. Let me hide some of this stuff. So I know that a lot of different people from different, oh, sorry, I just echoed. Wait. Yeah, you have to use the XYZ form. I can get a link to that a little bit later. So I'm just going to kind of show how I've divided this up and how I thought about it when I was making this, and show a little bit of work in progress pictures, because it's going to be a very similar workflow to how we get our thing done now. But basically, what I like to do when I'm in a Max scene or a KeyShot scene, it's always good to kind of, in the early stages, break down what are the big chunks of this thing, so we can start dividing our asset into pieces that we can start to complete, block out further, but also keep organized, right? And blocking things in, or turning things into a few different pieces, allows you to easily, put them in layers, or, control what pieces you render, especially when you get more complicated, like this gun, which has a lot of pieces. So, for example, we have the particle accelerator, modular front, and then we have the main body of it, which is also modular. Hypothetically, I don't have any other pieces for it, but as you can see, I modeled inside of everything and kind of where everything connects. So this whole gun is basically, theoretically, printable or watertight or whatever in a bunch of different pieces. So it was also really necessary for me to break it down into different pieces, so that way I could render it easily, turn off and on different pieces, and work with my scene file. Because in Max, you want to set it up in a similar way to this. That way, when you're modeling a stock, you're only modeling the stock. You're not modeling or hiding different pieces. You just click one button, it turns the stock off, so you can work on something else, and then you can hide some other chunk of it and work in these chunks instead of keeping it a little bit more nebulous. So I think it's really important to keep in mind in the beginning, while you're blocking stuff out, what pieces are what, and getting more granular as you go. But yeah, so I got a whole bunch of pieces here. I have like all of these shielding pieces that go here, broken into the ones that are closed, and then I also have the particle accelerator, I have the stock, I have the modular body, I have the variant where these things are covered up. And the reason why I'm showing you this now is I think it's important to think about this while you're modeling, because it makes your life easier in the end in getting this all in the KeyShot, right? Because then you already have everything simplified and broken into the correct groups. In KeyShot, I have a bunch of different materials. I have metals, colored plastics, rubbers, all these things, and usually I like to start with the base ones, but I just end up turning them into something else. In KeyShot, I think it's also important to make sure that if you're going to follow along during that part, make sure that you have the Pro version. I hope that they have a trial of that. But basically, you don't have to, but I recommend it. You can do all the same stuff in Photoshop, but it has this pin editor that lets you dynamically update lights. So I'm going to be using that later on. Make sure that if you can get that you have that. It'll make your life a lot easier than trying to manually make all of those and then update it through Photoshop. I'm also going to be using Photoshop and then 3ds Max, but a lot of these modeling techniques you can follow along in different programs. I do have a few I have a lot of custom hotkeys. I also have a few scripts. I don't have a lot of scripts, but I can send out links to those as I start using them for Max. And then I also know in a few different programs like Blender and Maya, some of the same tricks. If you're using Blender, I will not know your hotkeys more than likely because Maya Blender is very, very different. But anyway, I'm going to be modeling in Max 2017. So let's see. No, I don't have a UV map for this gun. So that's one of the things that's nice about using KeyShot is that basically the way that we project these textures, when you go to a texture, you can change your mapping type, and so you can do a box map inside of KeyShot, which just saves you the time of doing it in a different thing. So, to answer your question. Yeah, I also like to use a lot of Studio HDRIs, but it's really up to you what you want to do. But when we go and render this, that's what we're going to be using. So if you haven't used KeyShot before, I'd recommend just going through the Studio ones. I really like, personally, the 3-point sharp and high contrast ones. Those are my favorite, as well as sometimes the startup one. Just the default KeyShot one is very nice. But it really depends what you're doing. It depends on how many types of renders you're going to comp together in the end, which we'll also go over is the post-processing of stuff. I did a webinar earlier a while ago talking about a lot of that stuff and showing a little bit of how I comp different images together. So if you want to watch that, we'll be covering that later anyway. So if you don't go watch it, it doesn't really matter. But yeah. So I think I'm going to close this for now. So does anybody have any questions on any of that? Or is there anything you want to know before I start talking a little bit about the process I went through with that gun? And just show some of my work in progress images so you can kind of get an idea of how we're going to approach this, the weapon we're going to be making. Yeah, KeyShot's going to be like the last step, basically. We might throw it in the middle of the class and just like start looking at it, but I don't think so. I think that'll probably be the last thing that we do. Anyone else? I mean, no problem. All right, cool. So I'm going to I have to go through my folders for a second and pull up some of my old work in progress images for my gun. I've installed my computer, I've installed a new version of Windows a few times since I started this thing, so I don't have them all organized very well. But all right, so I'm just going to start at the very beginning of how I made this gun and kind of just show some of the process that I go through. And it's been a really long time since I started this too, so it's almost like a really bad time capsule I don't want to look at. But this gun that I made, the last one, started as something completely different, but I just kind of want to point out some of the things that I thought about and that stayed very similar throughout the project, and how I refined my ideas rather than necessarily having all the answers right away. And that kind of depends on how you work. Some people have an idea in their head and they just put it on paper. Some people, I think, struggle to visualize things. And so everybody works in different ways. So don't look at my workflow and say, oh, that's the way you got to do it. There are things that I think you should do, such as, for example, as I'm making this, I'd like to stay as low as possible in Geo. I don't like to subdivide stuff until the very end, because the thing is, the farther you get along with a piece, right, the harder it is to change later. So there's things where you should do because they make sense from like a process standpoint, but how you approach something artistically, everybody thinks differently, understands art differently, and just works differently. So figure out kind of like what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are, and how you feel like you get the best result. Don't think anything is rigid, right? Find your way to make art, but I want to show my way. And so a lot of times what I'll do is I had just some idea, an eternity ago for some really flat gun, and I just wanted to make like a super flat, simple gun. And it ended up changing a lot, but this is kind of the first iteration, and over time, it slowly changed as I worked on this in my free time. And I kind of refined and looked for the idea that I wanted to convey, because I wasn't really sure, and I think that's okay sometimes. It's a lot about figuring out what you like and problem solving. Don't expect to just get stuff done right away. Really put your time into it, because the thing is, if you're on a deadline for production, right, people care about stuff like how fast you do it and how quick you get to the end result, and they say stuff like, oh, it doesn't matter if a few things are wrong or whatever. But when you're at home, you have the time to really push yourself and problem solve. So when something doesn't work for you or you're not happy with something, I think really taking the time to figure it out is what's going to teach you the most. I've heard people say to me, oh, it's going to take you 2 days to make a wall? That's stupid. I could do it in 20 minutes. It's like, sure, but it's not going to look as good. And that's the thing, right? The better you can make something, the more you can market yourself, because people are gonna like it. And but not only that, each time you do something that's hard and you really push yourself, right, like your skills are gonna improve. You're gonna get faster at those hard things. So each time I've done a project, I always try and really push myself out of my comfort zone and be super hard on myself. But that way I'll get the most out of it. And it's kind of interesting, because over time, as you design stuff enough and you really push yourself when you're not completely happy, or to just take the time to get something right, or right enough, because you'll never get the perfectly right answer, but you'll find that you get faster at it, getting to the right answer, problem solving, figuring out why you don't like something. And you can even see, for example, when I first started doing a lot of concept design stuff, I would sketch over my things more. I'd problem solve in 2D more. And then as I progressed, I found that I could do things that would have taken me longer much faster, right? You get more confidence in your design skills. And sometimes to the point that you don't even need to go over it in 2D first. So I recommend, if you're going to be making something, especially design something, really put the time in to problem solve it, and ask yourself a lot of questions about it, and be very honest with yourself. No matter what you do, you're always going to make a mistake, or it could be better, right? But also try and find a balance between perfection, or the maximum ability that you're able to show and demonstrate in your piece, right? Versus your time. You don't want to go so hard and so long that you get demoralized. But anyway, the main point I'm trying to convey is I think it's really important to focus on quality over quantity, especially in your personal work at times, because those are the ones that really will help you get better and improve and break through a lot of those fears that you have about design or modeling and stuff like that. People in the end care about quality. So I don't really know where everybody is as far as their journey in 3D. I'm sure there's a few people in here who are in the industry. I'm sure there's students. And if anybody kind of wants to, tell me where they're at, actually, I think that'd be really nice to hear. So I can kind of get an idea of where people are. So I mean, if anybody's in the industry or a student, like if you guys don't mind just messaging, that'd be kind of nice to see, so I can kind of get an idea of the people that I'm talking to, and so that way I can kind of better tailor what I'm saying to different people. So I'm just going to assume that most of the people in here are probably students. It seems like a few of you are nice. All right. So it seems like there's definitely a wide variety of people with different experience in here, so that's pretty cool. If anyone feels like I might, oh shit, damn. Hey man, it's cool you're working at Microsoft too. Nice. All right, yeah. It seems like it's a very wide variety of people in here. So that's pretty interesting. Feel free to speak up if I'm not being clear about stuff or if I need to explain something better. I really appreciate that feedback. Don't feel intimidated or hesitant to ask anything. I'm not going to judge anyone. We're all here to learn, and I really like teaching, and I would even like feedback on how I'm teaching because I think it would help me to help you guys, right? This is really a class for all of you and me to kind of just show what I do so that hopefully you guys can get something out of it. But if I can give you a little bit more, do something a little bit better, I'd like to hear. Let me go back and answer one of these questions. So how long do these high-end 3D designs usually take you? How long would they give you if you're doing this at work for 343? So, for example, I think it depends. Are you referring to like if I had to do a gun, or Armando, are you referring to if I had to do a gun, or like one of my environments, or so I can better answer your question? So if I was doing a gun, I think it really depends, right? Like, you can usually get something done fast if you really need to, but if you're doing something personal, like I was saying, take your time. But how much time to invest in your person? So it really depends. It really depends on what it is, what the scope of the thing is. But I'll just kind of give a rough thing. So this area, for example, I did basically the whole area of the whole middle of this map as far as hard surface stuff. I did all of the modeling and design of it. Some of the shapes, though, I didn't block out as far as like at the very beginning, but I pretty much made it all from scratch. And I'd say that this whole thing took, I don't know, like a month or something, maybe 2 months, including all of the like tech stuff and all of that. But then some things, for example, like this, this took about a week, but it was also a little bit of kit bash mixed with it's like 50-50 kit bash and unique modeling. I even kit bashed some of my other stuff that I had made for Halo. So it really just depends. The gun, I worked on this over a long period of time, so it's kind of interesting to see when I started it versus when I finished it because I feel like a different artist. So I would say all in all, like this one, I definitely put like a solid month or 2 of actual work into, maybe 3 including everything else, like rendering and graphic design and everything. I did it over the course of about a year in my free time, And in between projects, I did a couple projects. Actually, I did like 5 or 6 projects in between starting and finishing it. So, it depends. But like then, for example, this thing I did in 6 days, including the renders, the spider mech. So I think it really depends. What are your goals? With this gun, for example, I really wanted to just push myself. I wanted to make something that I really felt like I could be proud of and grow and learn. And this thing, I kind of just had some silly idea for a spear mech, and it was just like this shitty drawing I made. I was like, oh, whatever, I'll just make it and see how fast I can go because, I come from a production background, so I don't usually make stuff that's very loose like this. Like I made the head in Moe and it's not very clean, and because I was just trying to learn the software. So it just, yeah, again, I think it depends what you're trying to do. Like this, I just wanted to see how fast I could do something and be happy with it. And this, I wanted to really push myself. And then like this mech, for example, this thing took me, I'd say 2 months or so. And it was, I think, my second real personal work project. But again, I really pushed myself. And so each time that I finished one of these, I felt like I had leveled up. Even the smaller ones, I always learn a good lesson from it. So it all varies, but I think the main point is I took the amount of time necessary to get them to a place that I would be happy with them and felt like I had grown or learned something, So I think that's important. Let me look at some of these other questions. So as far as how good I am at providing accurate time predictions to a producer before I start something, I think it really depends on what it is. When it comes to environments and stuff, it's much easier because that's what I spent a majority of my production career doing. Even though I did design everything that I made in production, it was all stuff that I knew how to do. I had a clear estimate of how to do it. When it comes to things like what we're going to be making, I think it just kind of comes down to how much time do you have, right? Like, if you have to get a gun done in like 2 weeks, you're going to get a gun done in 2 weeks. But if you have like a month to get a gun done, you can do that, right? So I think it really just, I don't know. I think it's a hard question to answer, but basically, if you have to get something done in a specific amount of time, yeah. Just knowing that you can get it done is all that matters, so if that makes sense. What do we do if we take too long and grow bored from the projects? So, again, everybody here is from different levels and experience levels, right? And so I know, and I remember when I was getting into 3D, I spent a week on a project. It was one of my first projects, and I was like, oh, man. I spent a whole week on this thing. I am so sick of this thing. I can't believe I worked on this long. Oh, I'm exhausted. And then, as time progresses, right, and especially once you start working on environments in a production environment, or just really anything in production, and you've been doing 3D longer, like the longer you do 3D, I feel like, the longer your tolerance for pain and projects are. I think that's something that's very real. It's kind of like when I draw, for example, my patience for drawing is like not even a 16th of my patience for 3D. So I think it just depends on the person, right? Like we're all going to get bored at some point. During certain points of this gun, I didn't care. I didn't want to work on it, and I'll be honest about it. I think everybody deals with that, and I think that's important to recognize. But what's also important to recognize is why am I bored? How do I get excited about it? And how do I look towards that end result, right, if I'm really not having fun? And I think other things come into it too, right? Like this environment, for example, I got really bored of this, and there was a lot of stuff I wasn't happy with, and I'm still not happy with. But there was things that I was happy with. So it's kind of finding what you're happy with and really enjoying that, I think, and then trying to get those things that you're not happy with. And then I think once you get something there, you're like, yeah, I really like this. It gives you a slight bit of excitement. And so each project that you work on, I think, you have to deal with different kinds of boredoms and different kinds of dislikes and things that make you want to give up and not work on it. But at the end of the day, right, like you just have to be disciplined and learn how to get around those personal issues and improve your are better than a lot of the people that are very well known. But the thing is, they're the people who, while they're very talented people, don't finish their work all the time. So nobody knows it, which isn't bad, right? But if you want to be able to market yourself and build your brand and, have jobs come to you, I think that it's important to really just kind of work through that, right? Like, if you put in the time now, you're going to get it back. So just stay focused and look at, I think, at the bigger picture of your board. Sorry if that's a really long example, but I really care about it because, it's a growing experience. Art is a learning and growing experience. It teaches you about yourself. It allows you to kind of figure out where you struggle and to try and work through those things. So let me look at some of these questions. Yeah, Alessandro, there's nothing wrong with spending over a month on a portfolio piece. If you want to spend a year on it, it doesn't matter. What matters is, what are your goals? Where are you going with this? And what do you want to show people? And what do you want to teach yourself? So when I'm making a project, especially when I was trying to get jobs and when I was trying to sell myself, improve myself, just to get in the industry and kind of build my confidence in my ability to stay employed, ask yourself at everything you make, just in the idea stage, what am I showing someone who's going to look at this, right? If you make something and it takes you a week and it's really cool, then that's great. But if you have a month or 2 months or 3 months and you take your time, really push yourself, learn a bunch of stuff, and you show people something that they've never seen before, people are going to like that even more. Now, it doesn't mean that quick stuff is bad. Quick stuff can always be great. Like some of the best art I've ever seen is just sketches. But that person puts so much work usually into building their fundamentals and their skills that's why they can do that fast. So a lot of it is really putting in that time up front, growing your fundamentals, understanding the fundamentals of whether it's modeling or design or art. Building those skills so that they're second-hand and second nature means that fast stuff is better in the end of the day, right? And that your understanding of what you're going to do is better. But yeah, so what I was going to say is, just a sec, let me look at these. Questions? Can you give some thoughts on how and what you do to look for when you are researching ideas for a new hard surface project? Yeah, I can do that. Honestly, I usually don't have, again, this goes back to what I was saying about how people see things differently. Like, everybody functions differently. Some people might have an idea right in their head right away. Some people might need to sketch it out first. Some people may focus on the story of something rather than the shapes of something. We all think about art different. We all function different. So personally, the way that I think about stuff might be a little bit weird. At least that's how I've always felt about it. I usually don't look at a ton of reference. Oftentimes I just kind of get like an idea in my head, or like a shape, or it kind of like comes to me. I think it depends. Like, if I get a brief, for example, like, so if someone is a client and they're like, oh, we need this thing to fulfill this purpose, right? I think having a brief is where you kind of look for reference and you find a way to satisfy a specific goal. When it comes to just doing regular art, or like one of my personal projects, oftentimes I'll just have like an idea in my head. Like, for example, the spider mech or the quad leg mech. I just wanted to have a few eyes on a circle because I wanted to do a simple shape. I didn't really think like, I don't know, I didn't really have like a specific idea. I just knew I wanted like bendy legs and a circle because I've never done a simple shape before of a project, and then I more than shapes. I usually like to work backwards, so I think of like shapes or ideas I like, and then I try and find the function to it, where some people like a functional idea and try and find a look to it, if that makes sense. But I have a lot of reference. Usually I don't know, I don't really get ideas from reference explicitly. I don't know how to explain it. Does that make any sense? And does that answer your question at all? All right, cool. Does anyone else have any questions? I should probably go back into talking about this gun if there's no more questions. All right, cool. So anyway, back to this gun. I was, blocking out stuff. I wasn't entirely sure. I knew I wanted to have a mech hold this in its hands. I wanted it to clip into it. I wanted the fingers to be long, so I blocked out a mech with these stupid long fingers. And my idea for it was it may socket into the shoulder, and so I have kind of a socket at the back of the stock, but I wanted the long fingers so that the mech could actually manipulate its positioning very accurately without having to move its arms entirely, because I thought that would look a little creepy and cool. And then so you can kind of see everything is very low poly, right? Like I'm blocking stuff out, I'm looking around, and I'm cutting up these shapes. A lot of times the way that I model stuff is I start with like these big complex forms, and I cut them up and break them into smaller forms. And the reason I do this is the less you commit, the easier it is to change, because I think it's important all the way up until the end to be tweaking stuff a lot. Yeah, Michael, I use Booleans. Sometimes I'll use them a lot, sometimes I use them a little bit. I think it really depends on what I'm doing. But yeah, by the way, I don't know who all is in here, but use Booleans. And if people say the N-GONs are bad, tell them to get out of 1985. Yeah, just have some clean geo, man. That's all you got to know. But yeah, I'll talk about that a lot. So yeah, you can kind of see, though, my idea is starting to get much more clear and similar to what I have at the end result. Again, blocking out this mech. Eventually, someday, I'd love to make this mech. It will look way different from the block out, but I want to kind of explain how this stuff all goes with. But yeah, yeah, Samuel, dude, my Booleans are awful. I'm sorry if you have to use those. Man, I gotta tell you too, I use Max, and Max's Booleans, I know that there's good ways to work with them, like using X forms and stuff, so you can like update stuff in real time. But man, Blender's Booleans are one of the biggest reasons why I want to switch to it eventually. Like, give it another year or two, because man, those Booleans are all real time and they're fucking awesome. But yeah, so going back to this, like, as you can see, basically I started with something really rough, and I'm just refining over time. When it comes to personal work, I kind of like to find the function. I really enjoy making stuff with cool shapes and things that please me aesthetically. I don't really like super overly functional stuff. I like it to feel functional, and I like to fake function and kind of think about how to imply function, but I also really enjoy making art and looking at art that's like where the function, you kind of have to discover it, right? Like if you look at the legs on this mech, like most people, I feel like, or some people would look at it and say, that doesn't make sense to me. Why are they like cloth and organic? But what I find fun about it is the freedom of trying new things and trying to find the function or think about, like, how could this work? So I kind of worked out an idea in my head that isn't really fleshed out, but basically like these tubes filled with gel, and there's some like skeletal framework in here, and they expand and contract and harden and stiffen, and they create movement through all of this. And I'm no engineer, but you can imply function, you can find function that gives you a reason to make the stuff you want. I don't think stuff has to always be like Paul Papera, where it's just explained right away. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I think his work is fucking incredible. But the point I'm making is, I think it's a difference between relatability and abstraction of the future. Because I've tried to come up with a reason for every single part of this gun, and maybe that'll also help with some of the like ideas about how I think about this stuff. Like I may be making a lot of random seeming stuff, but I also try and like put a bunch of thought into why these things are this way, and kind of imply this functionality. So for example, I looked up, this is an anti-hydrogen. Yeah, functionality matters in games. I mean, it matters in anything, right? It just depends on what is your target. It depends, like, what are you making this game for? What's the style? Is it like an Aaron Beck game, like Call of Duty, which I was just playing, and I really liked that stuff? Or are you making a Paul Pepera style game? Are you making something that's stylized? Like, it all depends. You know, this I think would fit more in like a Metal Gear thing. But I was still thinking about function, even though this is a very abstract future kind of thing. So for example, I looked up how an anti-hydrogen cannon or weapon would work. And anti-hydrogen, by the way, I'm not very smart at science stuff, but I tried my best to make it make somewhat sense, enough that it could somehow be explained, right? And that's kind of, that at least gives you some kind of way to try and sell this idea. So, for example, I have a particle accelerator. I have a system that cools the anti-hydrogen, which is antimatter, and to absolute zero for storage so that it can be packaged into the gun, and then it becomes warmed up, transferred to the charge exchange cell, shot through the particle accelerator, then it goes into this circular area over here, and it's packaged into a magnetic envelope that packages the antimatter into a cross shape, like you can see on the barrel, and then as it gets towards its target, the magnetic sealing ruptures in half, and it creates like this this just explosive that sears through everything. And I mean, it could really, in theory, if this was real, it could level a city, but it also could not if it doesn't use enough. But I also have, like, for example, this thing above the this like rod above the particle accelerator controls and manipulates the magnetic field and like keeps everything stable while you're moving around holding this. And honestly, though, a lot of these things started as just ideas for shapes and like things that were pleasing to me, but I wanted to find reasons to make them make sense. The lenses, for example, are actually gravitational distortions that bend space and time and create lenses. Like when you look at the edge of the sun, right, it bends light because of its mass. And so basically, somehow, this gun has enough power and can manipulate gravity to the point that it makes these lenses that are floating above the gun and also follow it. So I don't know what kind of technology you would need to do that, but that's kind of how I was thinking about it, because I wanted it to make sense. I mean, yeah, I know it's ridiculous, but it's also kind of cool, I thought. And then also the aftermath of a anti-hydrogen explosion would leave a lot of gamma rays, and so I created this little sensor package right up here that you can see is like it's just like, it basically creates a field. The reason why it sticks out is that it creates this nearly 360-degree protection from gamma rays for the user. So you can go on some kind of crazy spree and be okay. And then the rear stock is also a sensor package, so it kind of keeps track and monitors the environment around you. It hooks into the user or the mech and allows it to, work with this data, process this data, and interface with it. And then the finger clips are where it secures its, grip on the gun, but also how it controls it and tells it to fire and does stuff like that. It's all electronic signals. And then the power pack, which would have to give more power than the CERN particle accelerator by a ton, is somehow inside of this super futuristic power pack, which is probably run on, cold fusion or something crazy. But basically, a lot of this stuff just started as shapes and ideas that I had, and I tried to find the function in it, And even on a smaller scale, like how I designed each piece, a lot of it is shapes, but they're shapes that I try to make work towards this goal. Like even these weird little things on here, actually I don't explain them, but I know. Like even these weird little shapes that are like little finger nubs that come off the side, like, I don't know, I had thoughts on what that could be, They could be maybe like these mini cloaking things that shoot out, like when you have a tank or whatever, they shoot the smoke grenades out. Maybe they're like mini ones of those. I don't know. But so I mean, it's kind of like finding this balance between bullshitting it, finding something cool, and then having it feel like it makes sense, right? And if in function it somehow does make sense, that's good. But again, that's just me doing personal work. You know, if I'm approaching something for a client, right, who wants something much different than that, I'm going to tone it back and think about what their priorities are. So let me go back through these questions and just see what people say. Zachy, yes, functionality matters in really anything, right? I think it's finding that balance. Like I hear people say form over function or function over form. The truth is, in my opinion, it's a relationship, you know. How I think that design is broken into a few different things, which I can explain later. But basically, the proportions, the way that you detail something, the sizes of things, the balance of things, you know, all these artistic rules, right? Those things, in my opinion, are just as instrumental in informing someone on how something functions as the actual functionality itself. You know, if something well designed where you pick it up and you understand how it works, you know, that's aesthetics, because the function can look many different ways. I think this is important. But so, for example, you can have 3 different remotes that do all the same thing, but maybe one of them is really easy to use, it's beautiful, and it's equally functional. And so it depends. What are you making? You know, if you're making something beautiful or you're intentionally making something ugly to serve a purpose, right? These are things that are important to think about. But yeah, anyway, that kind of goes into what Samuel was saying. Like making something that looks cool and functions. It's just important to clarify that there's a difference between design as in terms of aesthetics, like what your eye finds pleasing, versus the idea and function of something, because they go together. But the thing is, right? Just a sec. Let me gather my thoughts. Sorry. The thing is, 2 things can function the same. One can look better than the other. It's a relationship. 2 things can have the same idea, right? Like I see a lot of guns that are sci-fi. They can have the exact same idea, but one can be executed well, and one can be executed bad. And it's just important to make that difference, because I think a lot of people like to wrap all of their feelings about stuff into these very non-specific categories, these very non-specific ways of critiquing and describing stuff. And that's one of the things that I'm hoping with this class to kind of solve. But I'll go from that in a little bit. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Thanks, I'm glad you like the lens thing, Zachy. I don't know what Tsutomu Nihai or something is. Sorry, I can't read that. Real-world armed manufacturers are hiring concept artists to design weapons. They need to understand the form cells on top of form. The game world, we aren't subject to real rules, so we can bend the rules. Yeah, no, it's true that we can bend the rules. I think that, though, you know, a good example of what I'm talking about, where 2 things can have a similar function, but one can be more beautiful. You know, I was watching this documentary on the F-35, right? And Boeing and Lockheed Martin both had the chance to sell their idea, build a plane, and sell it to the government and the Air Force and say, hey, you know, which one of these do you like better? Who's going to get the contract, right? And they were saying in there, and you can look at this with history or planes over the past, right? Like, not only did the F-35, which was way better looking, win, it could actually outperform the Boeing one. And they said, though, that even if 2 planes have the same functionalities, a lot of times the one that looks better wins. Now, this is important, and one of the main things that I kind of want to talk about in this class when it comes to design. I feel like in my experience and how I learned, I never went to school. I'm all self-taught. I learned about design from a mentor I got when I was at 343, and he gave me beyond all else, a vocabulary and a good base for understanding and trying to learn design. Now, I think what is important about the idea of having a vocabulary is that I hear people all of the time say stuff like, that's busy. And that's the extent of their critique, right? The problem with that is busy isn't specific, and it also doesn't describe why busy is bad. You know, a lot of people will say things like, well, it doesn't read well, or it's hard to understand. Why? Can you describe why? Sometimes people can. But I think overall people lack a vocabulary that is, one, abstract, and then two, I think, unified. You know, I can ask someone, for example, I've been in meetings where an art director will give feedback, and he'll say, this arrangement of flowers or plants isn't natural. So actually, I think I'm going to get into this right now. So he'll say, this arrangement of plants isn't natural. And it'll look something like this. Let's imagine right now that these are plants and that they're on a rock face, whatever. This is my beautiful rocks, and they're growing off of them. I don't really care. Why is this unnatural? If you tell me that something isn't natural, why is that helpful information? So let's break down why this is unnatural. And this is a whole huge topic that I'm going to go into at some point during this class. But the most important one is all of these plants are evenly spaced from one another. They're also the same size. Those are two ways. So evenness, basically it's evenness. They're even in size, and they're even in distance from one another. Now, why is this bad? It's not necessarily that there is wrong or right in art, but if I asked you, why do you like your favorite song? You would tell me, well, you might tell me, oh, it's really catchy, you know, I really like it. A majority of people are going to agree with you, right? Like, oh yeah, that song's catchy, I really like it. You know, even if they don't like it, they'll even say it's catchy. Why is that song catchy? Why do some people like classical compositions? Why do some people universally agree that one artist is good? Or why do people always like, you know, well-composed images? The important thing to realize, in my opinion, about design is that design can be broken into different subjects. It can be described in different ways. But the way that I like to think about design a lot of times, which is only a facet of it, is strictly visual, the abstract. It's proportion, contrast, value. It's composition in its essence, right? That's why it's not about, oh, this is a plant. It doesn't matter that those are circles, right? The idea is going to be the same. It's about the abstract of it, not what it is. Because this could just as well be, let's say that I'm making a sci-fi wall, and I'm making these panel lines. And so these are going to be panel cuts on my sci-fi wall. And then let's put some latches on it. And so this one I'm intentionally trying to make everything as even as possible. I'm going to talk about how these two things are the same, why it's bad, or not necessarily bad. I don't want to use the term bad because that implies judgment. It's not that it's bad, it's that there, I believe, is a way to make art that is aesthetically pleasing regardless of the content of it. And I'll answer these questions in a little bit. But there's very good words and vocabularies, and that's kind of what I want to teach, and I want to talk about why. I feel like a lot of people may say that they don't like something, but they don't understand and that's something they don't understand. They don't have the words to describe why and also to troubleshoot, right? Like if I ask you what's wrong with this and you don't have words to describe what's wrong with it, you're going to be really struggling to explain it and even understand it yourself. And so that's a problem, right? When we don't have these unified words and unified ideas about how to describe the design of something, how are you supposed to think about it and problem solve that, right? Like you problem solve it, but it'll be in ways that may not get to the heart of the issue. And it all depends on what your style is, what your philosophy on design is, how you think, all of that. But the way that I like to look at this is the same way that you compose an image is the same way that you design a sci-fi panel. And I'll explain why that is, and I'll talk about a little bit about human development in a second, but let's go back to this really quick. I also have a lot of stuff to say about all of this, so if there's any questions, feel free to ask. I love talking about all of this stuff, so I can explain anything you want information about in depth. But basically, let's talk about this panel. One, each segment of this panel is all the same. It looks very repetitive. Repetition is not bad, but notice they're all even. The distribution of these latches, the distance of height between these is all the same. And people just don't like things that are the same. The reason for this is, if I give you, let me pull up one of my design examples really quick. I just kind of want to go over a lot of this stuff in the first class because I think it's super important that when we're going into the next few classes, that when I talk about the designs of the things that I'm doing and giving critique on myself and others, that you kind of understand where I'm coming from. I'm not going to go too crazy right now. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to take a second and go read all of these questions and look at everything because I know I have a tendency to ramble and talk a lot. Since you guys usually work on alien concepts, where do you find examples? Honestly, Zachy, I think that for me, I like to look at older Halo work. I also like to look at Pinterest. Like I have when it comes to Halo 5 stuff, I really loved trying to push myself to find more complicated but beautiful stuff that I could make, like pushing myself to model more and more complexly, but also try and make it artistic and find like complex forms. So I really have like interesting shape folders so I can think about like different shapes or forms or ideas. I really never directly take anything from anything. I always try and like take the idea, but make it different or not directly copy it. Like for this one, for example, all I knew is I wanted it to be aggressive, treacherous, animated, and aggressive. Like I wanted you to feel really uncomfortable here, and I wanted it to look mean. I wanted it to guide the player forward. I just looked at like a lot of cars and stuff, but primarily I just start cutting in shapes and like looking for designs that I like. I don't know, I feel like at a certain point you kind of just are looking for smaller things, like for example, different ways to cut a line or to trim something or to detail stuff. And the rest of it's more like just the big idea. So I think a lot of the executions and the details and the small scale stuff, like the polish of it. Let's go. Silly question of the day. Will you be going over different render settings and how to get such... Yeah, I'll be focusing on the rendering of stuff, depending on how much time we have left, I want to get to texture creation and all of that. No matter what, though, I'll go over all of that as best I can. That's the goal. So, since you guys... are you going to go over the rest for eyes? So, Michael, that's another good example for me, I think, where I feel like the idea of rest, right? I think the idea of rest is good, but I don't think it's descriptive. So I'll kind of talk about other things. I think it's a good way to describe something that's very general. Boeing looked goofy. Yeah, it did. Yeah, I will be talking all about design vocabulary. Let's see, this is the stuff I'm here for, and this is the depth. Yeah, so I just want to talk about evenness. Now, to me, evenness is so important. I think that looking for evenness, different ways to see evenness, is one of my favorite things. Oh my god, I love talking about this stuff. I get really excited. All right, so evenness is so cool because evenness is basically one of the best ways to describe something. It's the most simple, understandable word. But evenness also means contrast. Evenness also means 70-30. Evenness also means primary, secondary, tertiary. Evenness also means hierarchy. Hierarchy also means secondary, primary, tertiary. They mean main and sub. They mean anything you want to describe more of one thing than the other. That is the key. Why is that important? That is the key. Why do I care if something's even? Is evenness bad? This is the biggest thing that I have people ask me. Why is evenness bad? I don't think it's bad. You're right. There's no such thing as good or bad in art. But there is if you want to make people attracted aesthetically to something. Can I make something even for a purpose? Yes. Evenness is a word to describe something. But the way that the human mind processes data does not like evenness. And I'm about to explain to you why and show you. Feel free to ask me any questions on this, and I can explain it as much as you want, because I love talking about this, and I like being asked questions. And it'll help us both grow, right? The more that I answer questions, the more I'll be able to explain it to you better. The more that you ask questions, the better I'll be able to explain it to you. So let's talk about evenness. I'm going to show you a child's drawing, and this is going to blow your mind probably. Child's drawing. This is one of my favorite pictures in the world because it is one of the most to-the-point images possible. Let's talk about evenness. What is the first thing that you're going to notice about this picture? You'll say, oh, those don't look like trees. Oh, those trees, stumps don't look like that. Grass doesn't look like that. Flowers don't look that great, the colors aren't representative. Or, you'll find all these words like the composition's bad. Why is the composition bad? What is it about this image that's displeasing to me? This is why, and this is why it's important to fight evenness. It's going to blow your mind, but basically, look at the distance between these stars. Look at the size of these stars. They're pretty much entirely the same. Yeah, these ones are slightly farther apart, but overall, they're very similar. Where's this character placed? In the middle of the frame. Completely even on either side. These trees, the same distance apart, more or less. The same size. Even end in the middle of the frame. The trunks barely even change thickness, and they're all even as far as width, from top to bottom. The flower placement is even from the tree and even from one another. So one of the most interesting things I realized when I was learning how to draw, because I had actually learned design stuff in 3D, is that evenness is bad, right? And I found that when I learned to draw, every single fucking thing I did was even. I kept drawing even proportions on everything. It was like my brain wanted nothing more than to make everything even. Now, let's talk about why is that bad? Like, why is it bad that it's even? It's not necessarily bad. No matter how hard you try, you will always like the idea or not. They'll at least agree that there's something to it, right? So, for example, when people look at a painting, a lot of illustrators don't focus on the design of the painting. They'll focus on the composition primarily, but not like if they have a mech, they won't focus on the design of the mech. They'll focus on how is it lit, all of these other things. So they're getting all of these things like distributing, proper values, composition, not making stuff even in the composition. So they're getting enough stuff right that it's attractive, right? That's the thing. It's about getting enough of the stuff right that your image is attractive. You're never going to get it all, but it's for spotting it. So that's not answering why, though. So I'm going to go to one of my images that I have. Before actually I do that, let me go through these again. Armando. So let me talk about how the brain processes stuff and why it's important. This image will talk about it, but before I go into that, does anyone have questions before I describe why evenness isn't necessarily bad, but not pleasing to the eye? All right, cool. So let me take a water and then I'm going to talk about this. No, so I'll explain it in a second. I'll explain it right now. So let's talk about evenness and different ways that it can be done and how you can look for it, right? So let's talk about first, why is evenness bad? So if you look at this image, if I asked you which of these circles is most important, you can't decide, right? They're exactly the same value. They're exactly the same size, which that neither is your brain cannot tell itself, and you can't tell yourself which is most important. You can't. And even if you can, it's not naturally immediately recognized, right? So now, when one circle is smaller than the other, you say, oh, the big one's more important. Maybe you'll say the small one is for some reason. Like maybe for some reason that's more important to you. But the point is, they're different. Difference, contrast, primary and secondary, bigger, smaller. Difference. Difference is understanding. Difference is clarity. It's clarity of shape, of proportion, of distribution, of form, of plane changes, of contrast between simple and complex. It's contrast. It's difference, and this is important. Yes, uneven is more interesting in ways. It's not saying it's bad, but you need to know when to use both. So my philosophy is, in design and in hard surface design, there's a way of projecting this patterning of nature, this unevenness, into your designs. That's not to say that the real world is always uneven. That is not true. But think about any human-made structure you see. Think about how often we tend to make things even. Think about a child's drawing. These are examples that when we really look at it, regardless of the context, right? So like if you say, oh, yeah, maybe it's even, but it's also a gun, you know, you're liking the idea behind it, but the proportion of it isn't aesthetically pleasing necessarily. Again, not bad. Evenness can serve a purpose. Repetition can serve a purpose. Any type of word or description for something can serve a purpose. There's no good or bad. But it's just like when you compose an image well, people are going to probably like it more. When you make music that is well composed, people are going to probably like it more. Now, does everybody like the same music? No. Does everyone like the same art? No. But people will generally agree when one piece of art is better than the other. Now, maybe it's not the design that people like. Maybe it's the composition, you know, of a painting, not the design of the mech. You know, if you look at a lot of concept art and illustration, a lot of times one thing I notice is that it'll be very well rendered, but the design is weak. Now, the reason why people like it, though, is that it's well rendered. It's still a beautiful image. But if it was a line drawing or a 3D model, or not rendered, you might not like it as much. And that's the point. So anyway, going back to what I was saying about nature and how you see things and perceive things, before I go into natural design and contrast and all this and projecting nature, just think about in the real world. So I don't know what that beeping noise is, but it sounds like someone's leaving, but I guess not. Let me use... by the way, anybody have any questions before I keep going? Because I know this is a ton of talking. And while you're doing that, I'm going to look up something. All right, so I don't know if anyone has any questions, so I'm just going to look for another image really quick, and then begin talking. Can you give suggestions when we read it? Can we read up? Honestly, I don't know. I would go read Form, Space, and there's an architecture book called Form, Space, and something else. If you remind me, I can find it, but it talks about some of the things that I've learned about design that are more specific, like specific ideas, specific things you can use to help you sell an image or like create certain effects. But I don't think it may talk about a lot of this stuff, but it'll talk about it primarily in a different context, which is also great. I think it's Form, Space, and Order. Yeah, that's correct. I think that's a really good book. When you're reading it, though, take notes. Read over the page multiple times. Like, really try and understand what they're talking about. Like, if you can describe it to someone else, and maybe even use it in your work without thinking about it, I think that's helpful. Like, I've really only gone through like 60 pages, but I took a lot of notes, and I feel like I learned a lot. All right, cool. So I'm going to quickly talk about a grocery store. And we're going to talk about, if I can find the image. Yeah, here we go. So we're going to talk about evenness and hierarchy and a few other things. And just design and nature in general and projecting nature into the real world. So I think that this is one of my favorite ways to think about design theory as an abstract, because I think most people who think about design get caught up on the function, the what something is, rather than how it is. I think it's crucial to decouple yourself from the immediate idea of what you're creating and find a way to make it work harmoniously with the function. So let's look at this picture of a supermarket, and I kind of want you to go in the chat and tell me, why do you understand this image? Even though it's busy, why do you understand this image? And I want to see what people say. Don't feel like you have to like be right or wrong, but describe the order. Find a word as to why this works. How is it recognizable? Why is it unitized? What does that mean? How does it look familiar? So yeah, actually a lot of those are very good answers, but the thing is, and what I think the issue is that I feel like you guys all are on the right track, but it's about how you describe it, right? Like I heard somebody tell me recently, the difference between a food critic and not a food critic is that the food critic has better words to describe how they feel about something. I think it's the same thing here. You know, you say composition, structure, unitized, familiar, recognizable, order, layers. These are all very clear. They're words that are very descriptive, but they're not descriptive enough. They're not telling me in what way is it composed well. In what way is it arranged in layers well? Like, what is a layer? What is structure? What is it? Why? How is it unitized? Why does it look familiar? How is it recognizable? What is order? So that's the real problem, right? And that I feel like is with design is that a lot of people use these words like, oh, it needs more structure. What is structure? How do you create structure? How do you recreate structure? And so when someone is designing something, right, if you don't have these words to tell yourself and diagnose and troubleshoot why something is the way it is and why you feel this way, you're not going to be able to start to understand how to fix it as clearly. You'll probably have to struggle a little bit more, and you might reach something that you like more, but I think it's more of like hitting something with a hammer versus cutting it with a knife. So I just want to break down a few things in which this is arranged. And I want to ask a question too. And I want to make an observation. One thing that makes above all else is the idea of grouping. So grouping is, I don't know if that's a proper design term, but it's a term that I use, and you know, it's a, let me get some really sick pink glow, purple glow around my red outline so you can see it. It's not strong enough. Let me make it harder. Get some sick spread on that, yeah. All right, hopefully you can see that. All right, so the word grouping. Oh man, I did my sick effect. All right, grouping. Grouping is so crucial to this. One reason, now there are a few reasons, and I think layering was the best word that I heard. Grouping is so important. If these images, if all of these products weren't arranged next to similar products of similar sizes, shapes, all the same color, like, same brand, type of object, if every single thing here was on a different shelf and every single thing was out of order, and we didn't have groups of similar things, these would read like chaos. We can also look at groups, not only in terms of the product itself, but how they're organized into rows. We have a group that has cat food and primarily cat things. We have a group that has a lot of, what is that? Like, I don't know, sauces and stuff like that. And then we have like, how a grocery store is organized, right? But it's a group. Now, another way to describe this is not just a group and grouped, but you notice that I used two different layers, right? I said there's the aisle, and then there's the groups of things in the aisle. Now what's another way to describe that? That goes back to the idea of contrast. Primary, secondary. We have the primary group, which is the aisle, which contains all of the other objects. And then we have the secondary group that contains all of the smaller groups of similar objects. And so in this way, you memorize how the store functions. You understand as simply as possible. See, grocery store people understood organization. In the same way that they organize a grocery store, you need to organize your gun, or you organize your composition. But what they did is exactly all the things you said, but it's about how you describe it, right? So I'm using the word group to define, so not only am I describing the group, but I'm also describing the hierarchy, the big, medium, small. So now all of a sudden, right, like let's say you go to the grocery store, you ask, where's this object? They'll tell you aisle 6. Aisle 6 is one single thing that describes all of the other stuff in it, or contains all of those things. So in that person's head, right, he thought to himself, it's on aisle 6, where all of these other things are. He knows what's on aisle 6, but he doesn't have to list them off, right? So if there was no aisle 6 and all the products were just scattered around the store, there would be no hierarchy for him to easily memorize. He would have to think like, oh, it's over there somewhere. It's busy, it's confusing. So it's this idea of hierarchy. The way that the human brain and that we process information is we ask ourselves, what's most important? What's most important? What's second most important? What's not important? We ignore that. When you look at an image, your eye always goes to the highest contrast area. Your brain is looking for this order, and it's up to you as a designer and as an artist to create this order in everything that you make. Now, it's not saying that it's bad if you don't, but if you want to make commercial art, if you want people to like your art, if you want to have consistency and be a production artist, you want people to always like your art. for the most part, right? Like there's times where, like, let's say you're prototyping or coming up with ideas, like, that's fine. But this is a way to think about structuring your work, composing it like a song into a way that people will like a catchy song. Composing an image well is an image that people will kind of universally agree is at least interesting. Or a sci-fi design is composed well, people will find that interesting. So I'm going to use another idea of hierarchy that's in a grocery store. When we look at this sign here, I used to have some better pictures that I took on my own, but this is what we got for now. So here, peanut butter, jam, mayonnaise, salad dressing, sugar substitute, I don't know, kale or something, whatever stuff, doesn't matter. Yeah, validation. That's a whole nother topic. But so let's talk about the hierarchy of this, and I'll talk about hierarchy and a few other things. But first of all, let's look at this and how this is hierarchy, how this is also organized and grouped. We have one single sign. This one sign gives you all of the information you need as to, one, what aisle it is, but also, second most important, what's on that aisle. Or maybe equally important. But visually, the way that this is represented is we have the large structure, which describes and tells you aisle 2. This is aisle 2. It groups these items all together in a simple, clear, singular object. But it still tells you all the other stuff, right? So we have small, which is the peanut butter, jam, jelly. This is the small. And then we have the large, which is the sign. So we have this hierarchy of like big, medium, small, and how the information is presented to us. Just in like we have the aisle, but then we have the groups in the aisle. So it's this creation of order, right? It's this this organization. Now, that doesn't necessarily describe the beauty and the natural feeling, but what it does describe is the idea of creating order. It describes that human beings have a certain affinity for understanding things that are proportioned in such a way that they are not even. Because then the human mind says to itself, this is more important than that. Whether you think about it consciously, which is definitely not always the case, it's about how your brain categorizes this information, right? And so that's why a grocery store is organized the way it is, so that your brain like gets it. And so you need to make your art aesthetically in a way that people can get it. It's not about just, oh, do people understand the idea behind my art? That's a different type of design and a different topic. Like, is your idea good? The question you should be asking is not right now, is my idea good? Is my idea composed well? Is my idea executed well? Can it be executed better? Can I use these words to figure out why this doesn't please my eye? I just want to go over again and say, art is not good or bad. Art is art, but commercial art, generally consistency and understanding why you don't like things will allow you to more consistently make things that you find pleasing to your eye. Now, you may not find the same things pleasing that I do. Nobody does. It's very subjective, but generally, having things that are proportioned well, having things that are not even, will be pleasing to the eye, and that people will generally like more, even if they don't know why. I can give a million examples of this kind of stuff and how people think about things, which I probably will, depending on how much time we have, because, I mean, I could probably talk about just design stuff and breaking stuff down for, like, this entire class. So we probably wouldn't get to any art stuff, but I kind of want to get a lot of it out of the way so that people can kind of understand where I'm coming from and ask me questions. So now that I've talked about all that, does anybody have any questions about that or things that they want answers to or that aren't explained well before I start going into a little bit more of that, explaining contrast and things like that? All right, I'm going to look for the next thing to talk about in case anyone's typing questions. Can you break your gun into groups for us? Yeah, sure. I can. I'll talk a little about how I do grouping. I want to clarify, first and foremost, every single idea that you have, don't think about it just in the context that you normally would, right? So when I was talking about groups, right? Groups can be a group, like let's say you have birds in the sky, grouping certain birds groups together into chunks. If I had, like, let's say I have an image of 100 birds, instead of having them all be placed around in similar areas, right? Putting them into groups, maybe groups that overlap or like sections, breaking these more small structures into less structures, but more simple ones. That can be applied to a group of birds. It can be applied to how you put products on a shelf. It can be applied to where you put stuff on your gun. This is why I think that people need to stop being so, and none of this is accusative, it's just, I feel like a lot of people they'll think about one type of theory or idea in a very single-use way, when really a lot of these are universal. That's why I just want to emphasize like the idea of music, right? It's about composition. It's about composition, but it fits many facets, right? It's not like, oh, I just make this way. It's thinking about how can I make all of these other things use these similar composition rules, whether it's drums or, making all of the instruments work together. I don't know a lot about music, but I'm just like giving examples. So, for example, when I talk about evenness could mean in proportion. It could mean in, let's say I have these plane changes. It's like having different plane changes be different sizes. So we have big, medium, small. It's if I'm lighting a sphere, that I have less dark area than light area. So it has to do with lighting. When it has to do with composition, it's this landmass is bigger than this landmass. It has to do with this building is more important and larger in the image than this structure in the image. It has to do with this is longer than that. I put this on this side of this detail rather than this one. I'm putting this here because of that. So evenness, contrast, all of these words, grouping, all of these words, be asking yourself in what way, if you don't like something, in what way is this thing even or this or that? Because once you find how you're doing things even, or you find how you're not consciously arranging things correctly or in a pleasing manner, I don't want to use the word correctly. I want to use pleasing because it's less judgmental. Yeah. Anyway, let me talk about grouping in my gun. But the point I'm making is think about composition in as many ways as possible, right? That's why I'm just trying to use so many different mediums to explain it. And then I'll go back to this natural thing. But let me talk about grouping in my gun super quick, go over the natural thing, and then we can go over some questions and kind of start structuring where we're going to go from here. So let's talk about, let me save some images off the internet of my gun. I'll give a breakdown of some of the ways that I'm thinking about stuff really quick, how I group them, and while I'm pulling these images up, if anyone has any other questions and things they want me to explain about my gun and how I apply these rules really quick, type them in the chat while I'm getting this all loaded and stuff. Also, sorry if I jump around a lot. I'm pretty ADD, but I'm trying to do my best. So, if you, any clarity anyone wants, let me know. That seems like there's no questions, so I'll just talk about how I can break my gun into groups. What will be our homework for next class, and when will we get critiqued? Well, What do you think about visual language during blocking like stop getting lost in the detail too soon? So before I talk about this, now I'll answer these questions. So for homework, uh, I'll probably shut up in a little bit because I need to get blocking stuff out and just start getting something done. Uh, I would say that for next week, try and get as much of a block out done as you can. Uh, I'll quickly, before I start getting into stuff, and after I'm done talking a little bit more about design, I'll talk about how far we should go. And that kind of goes into what Armando's asking. What do you think? Do you think about the visual language during the blocking phase? Yeah, I do. It depends. Are you doing it for someone else? For my personal work, I somehow, I guess, just have a visual style that I default to, and I usually have an overall idea, but I kind of just, I don't know, I've never really been a huge person that thinks super specifically about shape language, I guess. I don't know if that's weird. If you're talking about visual language as far as my vocabulary, yes, I think about it constantly. I think about why things aren't working for me literally the entire time, as well as the ideas of it. Art is super important while you're making art. Don't just make art and ask yourself a ton of questions. And really, art is problem solving. For, first and foremost, at least if it's for like a client. If it's for fun, it's as much problem solving as you want it to be. And then getting lost in the detail too soon, that's a skill you have to break out of. I'm a very detail-oriented person, so I do my best to not do that too. That's why I say don't subdivide anything until you're ready to commit and you know that you have a solid foundation to finish your asset, because you'll get screwed over. So I'm a very detail-oriented person too, so I like to get a lot of my detail in the blockout phase to some extent, because then I can kind of get that fun out of it, right, while not screwing myself over and having a lot of room for iteration and failure. I also want to just very much say failure is important. Failure is how you will learn. Everyone will fail. I fail. But it's about how we fix those things, right? So that's what I think is important, and I want to make that clear. Like, art is iteration and failure and learning, no matter who you are, how good you are, or what level you're at, and be okay with that, even though it's hard sometimes. So let's talk about grouping a little bit. I'll break down a few more ways that I think about my gun and how I designed it, how I organize things. So strictly grouping, though. If you take a look, my highest detail areas are generally, I often will have more than one of the same type of detail. I'll use it multiple times. I try to not have too many different types of details. And if I do, I try and make them organized in such a way that it's not overwhelming, right? Because this thing, in my opinion, I feel like it has a lot of detail, but I think it reads somewhat well. So just, for example, grouping, a lot of times what I like to do is, if you look, I have my highest detail areas are generally grouped. So I have like these simple areas, but then I have like these high detail pieces, and I have 3 of them. Now notice also, each of these, there's a rhythm, right? I have 2 closer to each other, and then 1 farther from the other. So I'm creating, if you divide this line of the particle accelerator with these details down the middle, you see that my placement of the second one is creating a contrast. It's got 70% longer area, 30% shorter. So here's the way that I'm using that and making it not even. Also, you'll notice that I have also, when I have this piece, I have another piece that supports it. So I have multiple similar pieces in detail areas. So the highest detail areas are kind of grouped together, right? Where a lot of the stuff in between is using repetition or just simple lines to kind of guide your eye in between them without it becoming overwhelming. So it's about balancing, making sure that it's less detail and simpler in the middle, and then more detailed in these specific areas. So I'm grouping different groups together to kind of make it read more as like, instead of, oh, we have this rubber bit, and then we have this, and then we have this block, and then this one, and then this one. Sure, we have these things, but they're all in the same area. And so it kind of gives them this unified feeling of togetherness. A lot of them interlock, which is another thing I'm going to talk about, because interlocking is a great way to fake functionality, imply it, and also create interest. But so you can see here, like all of these areas are kind of grouped together. Let me find a different image of it so I can kind of show you a little bit more close up really quick. So there's many other ways that I use it. Here we go, perfect. So I'm just going to show the top-down silhouette. So you can see here, there's this idea in architecture, the architecture book, Form, Order, Space, I think it's called, of the idea of a described line and a non-described line. So let's talk about the difference between these two and how I'm using this right here and how it's working with my groups and how I'm using this to guide the eye and also keep it simple visually. So these are two types of lines. We'll all agree that a text is a line of text. We'll also agree that that's a straight line. Now, we can also do, like, let me copy and paste. This is the best way to do this, by the way, just very slowly and manually. So you may say to yourself, well, all those lines are the same size and they're even, and you just told me evenness is bad. Sure, they're even, but they're serving a purpose. None of these stand out to one another, so they feel like a line. And the book used the words described and non-described. Now, why is this important as far as a gun? Well, a line is important because generally when you're detailing an object, like think about a banana. My friend Jehoon, who taught me a lot of stuff, he had this really great example. Spell banana correctly with Google image correct, because it's a hard thing to spell. So we look at a banana. Where's most of the detail on this thing? It's on the start and the end. Everything in between is just lines created by shading or very subtle detailing of the surface. But the highest visual strength areas, the biggest form changes, all of these things are on the end, and everything in between guides your eye between them. So in that same way, I'm using evenness, or I'm using repetition, or I'm using different but similar sized characters to create this line. It doesn't always have to be a very descriptive line. So the way that I see it, I'm using repetition here to create it so that none of these things stand out, so that your eye just goes over it and then goes to the higher detail areas that are more unique. And as you can see, I have these groups of details, and then I have the same thing that's much more simple, and then we have a more detail again. So this is how I'm grouping a lot of these things. Like if you look here, I place a lot of I place all my details generally in groups of like a few different types, and they support each other and help each other feel functional. Like if you look at this, like if you look at where I'm placing this thing, I have this piece, but then supporting it I have the latch that connects to it. I have these two latches that imply that there's a structure underneath that also connect to it. And then I have like these guys that kind of go underneath it. Now, they may seem different, but if you look at it at a broader scope, right, we kind of have these little groups and islands of details that are all kind of like together. Like I have these extra like nicks and whatever supporting this thing. I have these groups of similar details. I have this. I have like this latch, this light, and this thing. Like I try and place a lot of them together, and most of the interstitial stuff is like little subtle things that I'm using to interest the eye along my line work, like all of these little changes and whatever, like these things, they're still simple enough though that they read as a line. And where I'm placing my details is at the starts and the ends of these lines. So like if I look at this as a line, well my detail's here, and it's here primarily, and I have little tiny things that aren't as visually strong as the starts and ends. There's also another way I want to talk about where I'm placing these groups. One of them is kind of like when you have say you're doing a face for a character or a spaceship. Let me pull this up really quick. Like for example, this guy. One way that I'm thinking about where I'm placing things and how things are proportioned and sized is I like to think about offsetting stuff and the balance of things. So one thing you'll notice is that asymmetrically, this form is bigger than to here. It kind of, I have this angle, so it's asymmetric. Then I have this thing that goes up here, and then this side of the brow is raised up, which then I have this higher intensity area, which is the bullet hole that's up here. So I'm kind of creating like this zigzag through the face of high intensity areas of asymmetry, of proportion and balance, and stuff like that. So like here we have a dark area, and then we have the end of the scar. But above that, we have this area that cuts in. It's actually above the scar. So they're not on the same level. It's about offsetting stuff. Kind of like when you look at any of Sparth's compositions or whatever, right? Like your eye zigzags through the image. I have this one great breakdown that I like. I like to break this image down. So this is one of Sparth's concepts. I love how he does this. If you look, he has very few similar details. He has these green cylinders and a cylindrical shape. It doesn't have to be green. So he's actually mixing things together now. He's mixing color and shape to create this. But let's divide this down the center line. We can kind of see that if we divide it down the center line, our eye starts here. It doesn't really matter where your eye starts, but the most important thing, that's a very high contrast area that is a similar visual piece that echoes this green area. So now if we look at these similar shapes, the eye actually flows over this high detail area. And it also is offset, so we have the center one, we have the down one, the up one, and then the down again. So my eye is guided across this whole entire composition by these little groups of similar details placed in the highest detail areas that allow my eye to still get all of this extra detail, but flow over the rest of the composition, which is much more simplistic, much less low detail. So instead of reading like, oh, we have detail everywhere, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5 detail areas. Like really high detail areas with the most depth, the most contrast, the strongest silhouette breaks. And so what we're doing is instead of distributing these all evenly, right, we're placing these strategically to help us read this image easier. You know, it's not like he's not thinking about this. This is all very intentional on his end. The same thing here, you know, you talk about evenness, you also talk about dividing a picture. Like, you know, one of the rules is if you're like, oh, rule of thirds, right? You know, don't always place your subject in the middle of a frame. Well, if you look at here, his highest intensity areas with the strongest orange are all on the edges, and they're all in ways that guide your eye around the entire composition. And they're different distances from each other, and the rest is like massaging the eye without overwhelming it. So we have these groups of details of orange and like high contrast areas. We have the starts and ends of things are more important. So like the end of this wing is more important than any of the stuff in the middle of this wing. The end of the ship is a darker value, and the front of the ship is a brighter value than the middle of the ship. Like they're very different details. So we're detailing the starts and ends of things. We're grouping different high detail areas together with different sizes, right? So we have the smaller, littler details in here, but don't overwhelm the bigger details like these and these and these. So imagine if instead of having just a few orange accents, we had a bunch in here and here and here and here. It would be too much. So all of these things are placed there intentionally. So this is also a great example of grouping. Just look at the value, right? Like you could say that this is the highest contrast area. This is the highest contrast area. This is, and then this is in the back, right? But most of it is eye travel space. And so that's basically the same thing I'm doing with my gun. And also when you look at how I'm placing stuff, you know, I have detail on the bottom of the center line, above it, there. And then I also, if you look at the front, I have one that goes down again. And then from here, your eye goes up here, and it breaks the silhouette, and then it goes back down again. And so I'm trying to create like this balance and this this natural flow that guides your eye around the image without getting caught on anything. And then I'm just trying to like group stuff. And then, yeah, I mean, that's just one way to look at it. I could also think of how I'm placing these things in other ways, right? Like, I didn't think necessarily about the high-level group. I also thought about like, oh, you know, this detail is at the end of this line. So that goes back to what I was saying about trying to think about stuff in a lot of different ways. Anyway, I know that was a long explanation, but I just kind of wanted to give a good one. Before I move on to the last two things before we start modeling, anyone have any more questions? Does any of that make sense? Anything you guys want to say, you know, just type in the questions. Yeah, Brian, that's the correct one. Yeah, man, no problem. All right, so it seems like people don't have questions, so I'm going to quickly go into what I've been talking about a few times is applying this natural feeling that people have to hard surface design. Yeah, man, no problem. It's one of the main reasons that I wanted to teach it. I'm really passionate about this stuff. I love talking about it. You know, and to be honest, like it's a learning process that'll last you a long time, and it's a really fun place to kind of explore and figure out, you know, why do I feel this way about things? And I think it's interesting because you kind of like find that it also has parallels to real life and like philosophy and whatever, because it has to do with like why. But anyway, so I don't think there's any questions, so I'm going to talk about really quickly a few infographics. I'm going to go over my design, and then we're going to start making something. All right. So here's another paint over I did for my friend Ivan Nestorov a long time ago. He's my friend that works at Machine Games. He's a super cool guy. So if you guys know him, just let him know. That's okay. So he divided a lot of this stuff evenly, and I had given a feedback on a Facebook group that I run. But basically, you know, when I was talking about why is even bad, you know, I showed you the two circles, and you had to decide which one was most important. The thing about big, medium, small, right? Like, let's look at these two pixelated pictures of these trees. This is from, I think, an Andrew Loomis book from a long time ago, but I think it's a great example of how why people should care about this so much. If you make trees, and if you're placing trees, sorry, the Facebook, yeah, I think it's not the Facebook group. It's my friend, and I kind of post feedback on there every once in a while. But it's really his thing. He's also writing a book, and yeah, he's one of my coworkers. But anyway, so basically, when you're placing trees in a level, right, and you're making an environment, or if you're placing some kind of organics, you know, you're thinking, oh, I need small rocks, I need big ones, I need medium-sized ones, you know, I need cliffs, whatever. I need big trees, small trees, little plants, whatever. So the natural world has this idea of size difference, contrast, proportion changes, all of these other ways of describing things. You know, even the way that the structure of the universe is created, it's not necessarily about how the universe is, it's about how our brain thinks about it. Your mind has to categorize things hierarchically, like I've been saying. And so there's this concept that I was reading about called the hierarchy of ideas, and I think it's a psychological term or something. I don't know, but the point is, if you ask yourself in the universe, how do you categorize stuff? Like you look at a mountain, right? You say that's a mountain, but really a mountain is made out of little things like plants, trees, rocks, all these little things, but you still say it's a mountain. And then you say, oh, well, that's just a galaxy, but it's really all of these smaller parts. In the same way that you say, oh, that's a grocery store aisle, but it's made out of all these little pieces. So the brain processes stuff from big to small because, we're very fascinated with that, right? We're fascinated with understanding things by categorization and organization. And that's what science is. Science is cataloging and predicting how things are going to be based on the past and how things are organized, finding out the pattern and organization. But why that's significant is that's how humans like to think, right? Like we think of things this way. We think of, well, this is made up of atoms, but we also acknowledge that it's a singular object, right? Even our bodies. And so my belief, personally, is that this is why in design and art and music, all of these things that we care about this, whether we know it or not, our brains care about it because it's how we get our brain to get this natural feeling of the universe projected back onto us. And that's why trees are a great example, right? Big, medium, small. I can apply big, medium, and small to a sci-fi design. And so it's about giving it this natural feeling and this feeling of like pleasure to the eye and to the mind. It's not necessarily about what it is, it's about how it is and making it natural, if that's your goal. So in nature, everything is size contrast. Without it, it looks unnatural, and your eye sees it as wrong or artificial, as a better way to describe it. It looks man-made or unordinary. It's very rare in nature that we see patterns of perfect evenness. There are rock formations, plants, a lot of things like that, or even the human arm, right, is divided into even sections. But oftentimes we don't see this evenness. And, that's why when you draw a landscape, right, like you have to divide stuff and like your main compositional lines into uneven ones because it's natural. So think about applying that to guns and why all of this is super important for you. Because you'll make people find that pleasure that they found in a painting of a natural landscape in your gun, essentially, or anything else you create. So here's a good example. He broke every single panel up evenly, kind of like when you look at a child's drawing. A child's drawing isn't bad, but it's not pleasing. So in the way that he broke up the armor, every single section is kind of divided into these even medium-sized shapes. So they lack contrast. Which panel's more important to my brain than the other? Which one's big, medium, small? Which one's secondary, primary, and tertiary? When everything's special, nothing's special. So find ways to think of primary, medium, like evenness, primary, secondary, tertiary, contrast, 70-30. Just think about all of these things because in the end, your brain will find it pleasing to understand something because I could describe evenness as busy. I could describe something as busy because maybe it's even. Maybe things aren't grouped right. Maybe the proportions of two things are the same. Maybe where you placed your detail doesn't tell the eye to go one direction or the other. Maybe where you place something is central, so your eye just gets stuck on it and it doesn't go somewhere else. It's evenly in the middle. Maybe you evenly distributed stuff. Maybe the visual intensity of a lot of different objects are too close together and are conflicting, right? So these are how I'm using these vocabulary words to break evenness down into different ways of looking at it that are much more specific, abstract, and concrete. They're separate from the subject of the gun, and they allow me to not get hung up on what it is and the idea behind it. So I think that's primarily what I want to talk about. Also, one last final thing, to go back to the question about how I group my gun, you can also think about not only how I'm grouping details, but how I'm grouping pieces, right? Like these are different groups. different groups with different things. But you still read all of these different details, right? Just like the aisle. Instead of saying, oh, you know, you have a hollow site, you have these floating panels, or not floating, but you have this particle accelerator, you have this like light. You know, you would think about it if it was in the real world. You'd be like, oh, well, put in the sensor package, the modular base, the particle accelerator, whatever. And so in that same way, this could be aisle 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then my gun, like all of these, like maybe this is the tomato soup, maybe this is the toilet paper, and maybe this is the cheese. And so basically what your brain has created, right, with these different sizes and different groupings of objects is these hierarchies, these ways to think about something that's simplified, but yet complex at the same time. So, above all else, though, and I want your guys' feedback, I think it's important that I fully explain this and why I feel these ways so that people, as we go through this class, can understand exactly where I'm coming from and ask questions that leverage all of the things I've been saying. Because a lot of times if I don't describe this, people won't understand why something's bad, and so they might not want to fix it, right? Or they might disagree because we haven't talked about it, and I haven't had a chance to explain it. Not that I'm always right, but because you know, being right in art is subjective. But if you have any questions, if you don't agree or you want to talk something out, feel free to ask, because I think that through asking questions, you have a much stronger understanding of things, and you're able to really get it, I guess. And at least that's how I learned. You know, I talked about this stuff with people, and I've talked about a lot of this stuff for many hundreds of hours because I enjoy it, and I feel like every time you talk about it, you refine your ideas and your understanding of things. So I hope that all of this explanation hasn't been too long. I hope that people appreciate it. If it's too much talking, I can try and boil it down into more simple things. But I feel like if everybody could just let me know like how they feel about all of this, what they got out of it, and all of that, I would like to do that, and then we can start going into making stuff for a little while. I just want to answer any questions before we move on, because I'm going to be talking a lot about this stuff. And don't feel like you have to understand it. Like, all of these things and all of these ideas I've been developing and studying for quite a few years. And it's a very long learning process, but it's good, I think, to start like thinking about it. So don't feel be excited if you feel like you don't understand or you have a lot to learn. So when you get into details, how do you know when to stop? Well, that one's hard sometimes. I mean, it depends on what kind of artist you are. You know, some people don't care as much about details. Some like to do loose, sketchy stuff. I often, you know, I think it's a human thing, like to really enjoy detail work. So basically, what I'd ask yourself is, do you feel like it's enough? I believe that if you organize stuff well, you can get away with an immense amount of detail and have it still work. And I think that's important. You know, if you look at like Vitaly, right? Like some of his shit is crazy detailed, and whether you like his work or not, it usually generally reads very well. So. I do think that weapon jobs are very hard to get. I mean, think about it. Like 343, for example, has like 3, 4 weapon people at most. I think that's high estimate. They also do vehicles too, I think. Like, it is hard. It's a very niche job, and usually they only hire like the best people at it. I think it's like concept art too. I think concept art is generally one of the harder fields to get into. Not only because the mediums are so accessible versus 3D, they're a lot less technical, right? And just in that same way, like weapons jobs are very, very technical too. or they're just hard to get, right? Like a lot of people want to do it, but there's not that many positions open. Concept art's similar. Yeah. Yeah, I think about color. I'll kind of go into that. I'm going to start my gun modeling in a little bit. I've been talking so much, my brain's starting to fail, so I'm trying to do my best. Gotta drink some energy drinks. But let's see. Does anybody else have any other questions? All right, I'm going to start looking for images then, and can just quickly finish talking about the progression of my gun, since this has gotten a little bit disjointed. I don't know why I have 100 openings of the same. What? What is going on? Why do I have 100 of these open? Okay. All right. Let me pull up my gun again. So yeah, the main thing, let's go back to my gun, and as kind of a recap, I started with a rough idea of what I wanted. You know, I wanted a flat gun. It had a very flat and simple silhouette that was still interesting. And it started turning into different things over time. I started refining it. You know, I was thinking about different functional things. Like this area, I'm thinking like, okay, I need some kind of latch that is part of how this stock comes off. I'm thinking about, well, I want this to be a power pack that kind of like flips out and you grab your hand on it over here. I was thinking this is where I want the fingers to latch into. So I'm just blocking out these forms. I'm thinking like, okay, holographic sight or gravity sight. These are going to be panels that flip off. I want this angle. This is going to be a particle accelerator. Like it's very different from what it ended up being. And then so I was show a little bit more of how I refine stuff. Like you can see, I'm starting to get into detail, right? Get my plane changes and figure out and model some details in. But I'm keeping it fairly loose because I want to be able to cut it up and like really break it up as much as I want, or fix it, or model stuff back together, or iterate, you know. So I'm keeping stuff as non-destructive as possible, and just slowly working towards my goal from a very from the very basic to the very detailed, and trying to keep my head too far out of the details. You know, I think a lot of times in a piece you find a few details that really are what make the piece for you. You're like, damn, I fucking love that capsule I got there. Or like, that's sick. You know, so it's okay to find those things at first. You know, put in details that matter to you, but keep it loose still. Because I'm putting in a lot of details here and trying to find things. And so once I have a rough block out of the gun, you know, find a place to start. Often I think it's easiest to start on the thing that you feel most comfortable with, that you're not going to change, and is the easiest to do. Because just getting in there and going from like big to small and solving each group or like piece at a time, breaking it down, allows you to kind of think about it in a less overwhelming way. Instead of thinking like, oh, damn, dude, I got to do this whole gun, you just think like, oh, okay, I'm just going to focus on this stock. So I think this was before I started modeling and doing high poly stuff. All I did was this. This is the extent of my big blockout. Now, as I went to each piece, I refined the blockout greatly. But so this is my first piece I did on this gun, high poly. I modeled it in Max, and since I was going to just ZBrush it, I kind of just Dynameshed the Max model, but the rest of it is all sub-D in Max. In this tutorial, though, we won't be using ZBrush. But yeah, so find a place that's like easy for you to start, that you feel kind of confident in after you've done enough problem solving. I think it's important to find a place where you're like, I like this. If you don't like it, be very honest with yourself. You know, a good part of becoming better at design is figuring out why don't I like it, and then using your vocabulary to figure it out and developing that eye for it. Because the thing is, like, the more problems you solve, the easier it is to get to that answer you want. And in the future, to kind of not have those problems anymore, or at least know how to solve them sooner. So I got to a point where I was like, all right, I'm overall pretty happy with this. I feel like some of it works. There's a lot of it I wasn't sure how it would work, but that's just part of the design process is bringing it all together, right? But you have to commit at some point. Um, well, to be honest, I learned a lot of design stuff doing abstract things, abstract architecture, like Forerunner stuff. A lot of my art kind of has, to some extent, some influence from that. It has less of it now, but I like very angular stuff. A lot of my influences are, I don't know, I don't really know how to explain it. A lot of times I base a lot of the things that I like just around organizations of shapes or like ideas. Like, for example, if I'm making a sci-fi gun like mine, you know, uh, I really wanted to have, I wanted to find my own details and stuff. Um, I guess I like to find my own stuff, but kind of draw stuff from other people. Like, for example, simple shapes for details are ideal because the smaller something is, the more simple it should be as far as its forms. To some extent, right? Like there's a reason why capsule shapes are cool because they're very simple. That's why people like notches, like inset boxes. They like circles. They like capsules. They like more simple shapes because the smaller stuff is, the more simple it is. So I try to find, for me, like different organizations of shapes and like simple shapes that I liked. So I have this cross shape that I use in a lot of my art. Because I don't know, I personally try to not copy people as much as possible, and sometimes it makes my life harder. But like, if you look, I have a line with a circle. So if this was 3D, it'd be like a capsule with a circle, and I have the capsule T. I don't know, I guess I try and find what I like about other people's stuff and then make it my own, I guess. I like forms that are highly dynamic. I like things that interlock, which I'll talk about later, because I think interlocking is the fucking coolest thing ever. But yeah, I don't know if that entirely answers your question. I feel like you just kind of make art, and you're gonna have a style, right? No matter what you do, whether you like it or not, you're gonna have a style that reflects what you like. So anyway, point is, keep it low. Start blocking out one thing at a time. So like here, I kind of got this thing going. I started like blocking out the next thing. Let's open a little bit later. I'm just going to keep going down. So as you can see, I started refining this middle piece, just bit by bit. I started getting this thing, which is the sub-D version of the middle piece. And you can see I'm slowly starting to refine it. Yeah, during this process, I used booleans on some of the stuff. Some of it I didn't. But you can see it's starting to come together. And I'm just doing this piece by piece. I started blocking out this interior area, getting all the details in as low poly as possible. The important thing is that you get all of your forms, a lot of your details already in while you're blocking out. So that way you're not having to move them later. So here's a picture of the wireframe for this. And so this is actually a pretty good example. So a lot of this has most of the detail cut into it, or a good amount of it, but it's not subdivided yet. And so you can see about how detailed I go before I start to finish stuff up. And then this is the sub-D version with some really bad colors on it from long time ago. And then I'm starting to like block out this area. I've molded these pieces together. Started figuring out this area. I still had to figure out how was I going to connect and interlock these two areas and this area. I wasn't sure yet. I'm starting to like figure out these things. And let's see. Quickly going to go through this. So at one point I had finished this piece for the most part. I only had a few things left. It's all sub-D, all high poly. But you can see I kind of worked from the back, from the stock forward, just refining as I go from the block out to the final. And then, so after that I decided, well, I need to figure out this area, right? So I need to go to the front of the gun. So I started breaking stuff up, getting closer to my details, refining, figuring out what the main shapes and forms are going to be, iterating, figuring out the cool things I want to convey. So I'm starting to see how it looks coming together, right? I got a lot of my shapes in here. I made this piece and I reused it 3 times, which is another design thing. And so blocking out the topology for this guy, it goes on top of all this. And then so I started refining the fins, figuring out how I want them to connect with the other parts of the gun, detailing out these things, figuring out this plane change here, you know, just kind of screwing around, trying stuff. So then I started trying to figure out the particle accelerator, so I was playing around with arraying some of the other details I had made into like triangular formations and stuff, which I think would have been cool, but it was too much for this gun. It wasn't going to work. So I might do that in a different one. But then after that, I went in and started figuring out, well, okay, I need a more solid structure than the fins that I had, but I still want to keep the idea of the fins and the repetition. I didn't really, in the end, like the idea of a beam passing unexposed. I thought that felt a little bit weird for a particle accelerator. Yeah, but then it's just a process of refinement, finding shapes. And then all of a sudden, these things start coming together, right? We start subdividing, detailing stuff up, figuring out these things. It looks suggestive, so I ended up changing that, even though it's funny. And then starting the high poly process on these pieces once I feel like I've gotten a decent bit away from it. And, you know, as you can see, I kind of only have this thing and this main body piece. I'm slowly refining it, right? Like you see, I finished the end piece, but I didn't finish this piece. It's still unsubdivided, but I'm cutting stuff in and changing it as I go because I'm not sure how I'm going to connect all of these parts yet. And this is as I get closer to the final product. And you can see that through just working on each piece, solving the problems, and figuring out how they work together, you know, I came to my my end result. And so this is how I like to work. It's like a controlled accident, I guess. You know, I don't always have an idea in mind, but yeah. So I'm getting closer and closer to my end result, right? There were things that I actually didn't solve, like I didn't have as many details in between these and supporting them as I'd liked. But you know, there's sacrifices, and then also if you zoom out, no one cares or knows. So find that balance. Find the balance between caring and not caring. And as long as you're overall like happy with a lot of your stuff, that's all you really need, and that you're happy with what you did. Yeah, so I think that really covers pretty much the whole process I went through. It's very iterative. It's very detailed to not detailed. It's very course correcting because I feel like good design, you never get right the first time. Or exactly right. Like you might get the big idea right, but then you have to kind of course correct as you get closer and closer to the final result. So, yeah, that's basically how I think about all this stuff. This is my thoughts on design, and kind of the most important things I want people to get out of this class.